In this presentation, we're going to pursue our focus on delivery by looking at ways to identify, implement, and share best practices of online teaching. As I mentioned in the preview, we're going to be looking at a series of lists and inventories of best practices. You can take a look at these. They're going to be centered in 4 different areas: the effective principles and practices of distance teaching, some common learning styles that you're going to experience when you're teaching online, some learning strategies that the distance learner should be aware of, and something that perhaps you can provide as an addendum to your course to help them become more successful. And finally, we'll learn at some tips that you can use for helping online students succeed. So if you're ready, let's go to the next slide and look at the first set of principles and practices. As we proceed through each of these slides, I'm not going to read each of all the text that's on the screen. I'm going to assume that you can read that for yourself. I want you to take enough time with each of the slides to become familiar and have a level of understanding with, in this case, each of the 7 principles that have been identified for effective distance teaching. When we get to the end of the session, I'm going to have you logging into a discussion board in which you're going to be describing some of your own experiences with distance teaching or distance learning, and sharing ideas about best practices. So as you go through these slides, pick maybe 1, maybe 2 principles or tips or whatever we label them for you to discuss in the group later on. This first slide is as it says, key principles for effective distance teaching. I would point out to you that some of the most important ones, certainly principle number 1 is got to be the most important. Setting clear goals for your students, making sure that they understand what it is that's expected of them in the course and how they're going to proceed through the term. You can look at the other 6 principles and decide whether or not those are as important to you. Something you might want to, again, jot down and share in the discussion group that will happen at the end of this presentation. All right, so take some time with this. You can pause the presentation if you'd like. When you're ready to move on, we'll take a look at some common learning styles found in the distance classroom. I would think as you're looking at effective online practices that this slide is something that you might want to keep available as you're developing your own course. Take a look at these 2 columns. The right column is students that would probably perform better in a traditional face-to-face course, and on the left are students that we think would do well in a distance ed environment. Notice how different some of these skills are. Let me just point out a couple of them. Certainly a distance ed student must have excellent time and management skills, but in many cases so does a traditional student, although their environment is much more structured. One of the things I think is most important on this slide is the third one down. The distance learner learns best by reading or watching, whereas the traditional more by listening and speaking. And if you recall our review of pedagogy and andragogy and elegogogy, the students that learn best by listening and speaking are often the adult learners, which is why online learning is more of a challenge when you're using that or as a modality for teaching adults. Okay, so consider that when you're creating distance learning, most of your learners learn best by reading or watching, and that's why I've set these presentations up to include some video in each one and a narrative. So I'm hitting both the student that likes to watch a presentation and the student that likes to listen to it. Okay. Another key concept here certainly is that distance learners are very self-motivated. And the final one on here is also important. They enjoy taking control of their own learning, whereas a traditional student favors being led by an instructor. So again, pick out one or two of these learning styles that you think are most important to share with your cohort members in the discussion group at the end of this presentation. Let's go ahead and take a look at the next slide. You're going to notice some obvious redundancy and repetition in these different lists of strategies and tips. Remember, as I mentioned in the video presentation that introduced this topic, that I'm pulling these lists from the research, from books on best practices in online teaching, but also in talking to other teachers and instructors that are teaching it online. So some of these are the same, things like becoming responsible and being motivated, to a few that on this one that might be a little bit different. For example, item number 2, learners need to recognize their own strengths and limitations. In many online venues, learning management systems in particular, in Blackboard as one good example, on the home page of Blackboard there's actually a little test, if you will, a quiz, so that the potential distance learner can gauge whether or not they have the strengths to be a good distance learner. And it's something as an instructor you might want to consider having your students do as a matter of introduction to the course. Take this little quiz and share your strengths and limitations when it comes to being an online learner, so that as an instructor I can help address those. Okay. You can see some of the other best practices, learning strategies again here, being able to deal with content and being able to reflect on what they've learned. So that's why the asynchronous format of online instruction really can be very powerful, because it does allow students the time to absorb what they learned in the course, and to reflect on what elements of the content they have accepted and which elements might be a little difficult for them to understand. And then they can obviously work with their instructor to overcome some of the barriers that they have to understanding the academic content. Okay, let's look at the next group of effective practices, best practices. Now this is probably my favorite slide in this presentation. This was part of some resources that I found online, and you just got to love the focus of this particular list of best practices. It talks specifically about the best practices and expectations from an online instructor. And principle number 1 is a great way to start. Show up and teach. What they're talking about here now is maintaining a presence in your online course. This is not something that you visit once a week. This is not something that you wait for the student to communicate with you. You're expected to be in that course on a very routine basis, responding to the students and their contributions. If you ask them to post something in a discussion group, respond to it. If you ask them to participate in a chat room, then join them in the chat room. If you've asked them to submit a paper for your review, then review it in a timely manner. But principle number 1 is a real key one. It's amazing how many online faculty simply think that once they've got their materials up, in a learning management system, that their job is over. They don't really need to participate again until they're ready to grade, provide the grades to the students at the end. So you can look at at some of these 10 principles. I also like the last one. It's kind of, walk a mile in my shoes kind of thing. Before you make your online course available to your students, take the role, if you can, of a disinterested student that's coming into your course for the first time, and click on the links and listen to the presentations and read the syllabus to see whether or not you have answered potential questions that are going to come up. You're not going to be able to answer all of them, and certainly the propensity to have students with different learning styles in your class is going to make it important that you try to answer as many possible questions as you can with the course material that you have online, but you're still going to have to expect them, students, to be asking you additional questions, follow-on clarifications, and so forth. But let somebody else, if you don't have the time, or if it's taken you so long to develop the course that you're just too close to it, have somebody else, a friend, a spouse, another student that has maybe already gone through the course, take the course individually, take the course by themselves, and get some feedback from them about whether or not you have correctly developed and implemented your course. Some good ideas here, some real good ideas. Take a few minutes, maybe pause the presentation here, look at these 9 principles, and make sure that you understand what they're talking about. This is actually the last slide in this presentation that offers you a litany of tips and techniques for best practices. This one's entitled Helping Online Students Succeed. And what we're talking about with this particular presentation is things that you can do as an instructor to make your students more comfortable in an online environment. Some of these may have been reflected in previous lists, but this is primarily kind of new, and one of the or two of the most important links in here that I want you to look at and consider is the 4th link down, placing a link to technical support so students can contact support directly. As I did with you earlier, I gave you links to the online Blackboard help. I gave you links to the RMU help desk, and I gave you a way to contact me directly. Those are very important tips. It's a very important best practice for dealing with online students, because at some point, if they run across too many technical problems or they can't resolve an issue that they have locating content resources, they're going to stop. They'll just kind of give up. Okay, I mentioned the last one in previously. If you're asking them to be in a chat session, then get in there and participate with them, so that they can ask you questions in a synchronous environment, in a real-time environment. So take a look at some of these best practices for helping students. Again, maybe write down one or so that you think is most important there. And by now you should have a fairly comprehensive list, maybe of 4 to 6 important practices that you'd like to share with the others in your course. So go ahead and click on the next slide, and we're going to talk about how this discussion board has been set up so that you can share these ideas. A discussion board has been created in the discussion forums. It's part of the course tabs. You see it below, an example of it below. Discussion forums on the left-hand side is been underscored. Go ahead and click on that tab, and you will see this discussion board that I have set up called Effective Online Teaching Best Practices. So what I want you to do is go ahead and click into that after you've had some time to reflect on this presentation, and identify and post at least one example of best practices in online teaching, either something that you experienced as a student, or perhaps you did yourself as an instructor, or perhaps something that you witnessed you witnessed the instruction and you saw it going on. I want you to describe how the practice was implemented, how it reflected itself in the online classroom, and offer some comments yourself about whether you thought it was successful or not. Now, as part of this project, again, you're going to post one item, okay, one personal example, but I want you to read 2 other posts and comment on them. It's fairly straightforward on how to do that. Once you get inside the forum, you just reply to a post. You're going to be actually doing 3 things. There's 3 components to this practice. You're going to post your own, and then you're going to reply and have a discussion on 2 other posts. So I'd like you to do that by the end of week 6 of our 8-week session, and do a good job on discussing the best practices of effective online teaching. And that concludes our presentation. You've got your assignment, and you can move ahead with course outcome number 7 and start looking at some methodologies for assessing the distance learner.